All right, good morning, everyone. We'll get started. I know some people are starting to join us, but our speaker today has a great deal of information to pack in the next 45 or 50 minutes. We want to make sure we get started as close to 10 o'clock as possible. My name is John Donadio. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Association of Counties. I'm going to welcome you to the first in our series of free virtual workshops in 2023. This one is entitled Domestic Minor Human Trafficking Prevention, as a follow-up to our December of 2022 Summit on Human Trafficking. This session will provide information on the human trafficking of children and how government agencies, law enforcement, and citizens can work together to prevent the exploitation of our children. A couple of housekeeping things before I introduce our guest speaker. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, please put them in the Q&A and we will make sure to get them. This presentation will also be available on our website, both the video and I think the PowerPoint presentation, right, Gina? We can do that too. All right, so this will be available. We'll make sure to distribute that to everyone on this call. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce to you Ms. Gina Hernandez. She is the Executive Director of Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey, which is committed to building a brighter future for children by promoting family wellness, positive parenting, healthy child development, and nurturing communities. And if that's not enough, she's also the Executive Director of the Child Wellness Institute, which you established, I believe, right, in 2019 to offer healing-centered and resilience-building skills to professionals, children, and again, families. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Gina Hernandez, and the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to the New Jersey Associations of Counties for lifting up this issue and this topic of human trafficking. We are really excited that people are talking about it. Again, there was a surge a few years ago with people really talking about it. And so we're really excited. And like you mentioned, I work for Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey. And like the title here says, I focus a lot on prevention. And so while it can be hard sometimes to wrap your mind around how to prevent something from happening, that's really what we've spent the last decade or more doing in the realm of trafficking. The reason it's called domestic minor sex trafficking actually is because my expertise and where our expertise lies is working with kids and ensuring that our children are protected and safe and not ending up being recruited into trafficking. There's a lot of information, so I'm going to just start my PowerPoint and please feel free to share questions that you might have in the Q&A box as well. Just for some context, Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey is the parent company of the Child Wellness Institute. We call it Child Win. And so this is kind of our partnership. My first question, if you're logged on, is if in the chat box you can let me know what is your level of knowledge when talking about human trafficking? Would you say it's like a lot of knowledge? Would you say moderate knowledge? Or would you say no knowledge and that's why I'm here? Teach me. So if you can just throw in the chat box right now, just a lot of knowledge about it, moderate knowledge, or no knowledge, that would be really helpful for me, just to be able to see kind of who's in the audience and what level of information to be focused on in the next 40 minutes. Oh, the chat is disabled. You cannot type, so people are using the Q&A. Moderate to a lot, not much knowledge yet. I like that, yet. Absolutely, I think they just enabled the chat. Moderate, okay. No knowledge. All right. I'm looking through it all, excellent. Little moderate. Fair, okay, excellent. Thank you so much for just kind of sharing with me where you're coming from. So when we say human trafficking, a lot of times people think to themselves, oh, is it like that movie where someone got kidnapped and taken, right? And so that could be what human trafficking is, but really the definition is in a non-scientific way, it's the process of buying and selling a person or a human being. A lot of times people think, well, that happens somewhere else. Like it couldn't possibly happen in New Jersey. If you've seen the news, ever seen any of the news coverage of it, it absolutely happens in New Jersey as well. And so today we're going to focus on the exploitation of children specifically. Child sexual exploitation is the most hidden form of child abuse. It's the nation's least recognized epidemic, and that is because it's hidden. Most people who are exploiting children are not doing so openly, and they're trying to keep it quiet. So the differences between adult sex trafficking and child sex trafficking, there is kind of a nuanced difference. Both include the recruitment, harboring, provision, obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, right? However, in the adult version, the act has to be induced by force, fraud, or coercion. When we look at children, the sheer fact that they are under the age of 18 means that they cannot consent to being exploited. So I can't say that enough because a lot of times when we're working in this field, somebody might say, yeah, but she said it was fine to take pictures for money and then have sex for money, and she's 16. So no, there is no consent in New Jersey for being exploited when they are under the age of 18. So you'll see that difference in the definition, right? So again, minors cannot consent to commercial sex. They cannot consent to it. And what that means is, when we're talking about commercial sex act, it means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. So it doesn't always have to be money. There are other things of value, as you might guess, that can kind of fall into this category, such as housing, right? A place to stay, food, right? Clothing. So there are other pieces when we talk about value that doesn't necessarily have to mean money, although oftentimes it does. In this presentation, I use a lot of acronyms. I say CSEC a lot. That's the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And if I say CSAM, that's child sex abuse material. And so you can see that the language that we use might be a little different than what you're normally used to. And other places that we see our children being exploited in New Jersey are escort services, stripping and dancing, gang trafficking, tourism. So just to kind of lay out the language, if I'm saying CSEC or DMST, that's what I'm referring to as the commercial sexual exploitation of children, domestic minor sex trafficking. And so what is the scope of this issue? Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focused on sex trafficking. There are a lot of organizations that work with labor trafficking, and particularly labor trafficking with youth involved. And those organizations are fantastic. We work alongside them, but that is not the area I do most of my work in thus far. So I just wanted to be transparent about that and acknowledge that labor trafficking is an issue as well in our state. So the national scope is that despite what people might think, 83% of people trafficked in our country are actually US citizens themselves, and every single state has a cases reported. And so where those reports go typically are the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And one of the leaders in this field is a group known as the Polaris, or it used to be a Polaris Project, but Polaris. And so you can see the breakdown and how the cases look with labor trafficking versus sex trafficking. When we look at the average age of time when somebody started to be sex trafficked, that age is around 17 based on the information and data that we have available to us. So again, a minor, and very oftentimes, me personally, I've worked with survivors who are much younger than that. I am also a licensed therapist as well. So I have worked with a lot of survivors and their children. So they are younger than the age of 17. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reviews 25 million child sexual abuse images every year, 25 million. And as of this last year in 2022, the United States has now just moved up as now being the largest producer of child sexual abuse content in the world. A lot of the content was originating from the Netherlands, but now has been housed and moved over to the United States. And so that number has increased, and particularly during the COVID period of time, the last report that came out showed a spike at the first few months of 2022. So again, child sexual abuse content is being driven, and people are purchasing and wanting that content, which we'll talk a little bit about what the scope of the problem really looks like when we're talking about human trafficking of our children. So the data every year that we look at is kind of, where does New Jersey rank? We're the 12th highest case volume of all the states in the country, yet we're like this big, right? And so why is that? Why is that? If you went to the wonderful summit that was held by this group, you heard a little bit about what the issue is with New Jersey, is where we're located and how many people are in it, as well as the fact that there are cities around us. We have a lot of highways and truck stops. We also have a tourist destination in Atlantic City. So there's a lot of events happening, sporting events, and people coming in and out. And when those things happen, the demand increases, and then we start to see more of an influx of people wanting to purchase, particularly children. And so we're a very vulnerable state, despite our size. Where does it happen? Everyone asks me, like, where should I be looking? Well, the unfortunate part is that with the internet, it really can be anywhere. And so yes, sporting events, arenas, highways, right? Truck stops, transient places, but also hotels, motels, massage parlors, and also online. So now we have social media, we have gaming, where a lot of kids can be targeted through gaming systems and conversations that can happen in an online platform, essentially anywhere. And so when I move into this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the faces of exploitation and the components that make up the sex trade when we're talking about trafficking. And you remember the original definition, right? That there are kind of different components to this. There are the traffickers themselves, there are the people buying the sex, and then there are the victims that are being exploited. And so in terms that are somewhat uncomfortable, and I apologize for that, and of course, if you need to take a moment, this can sometimes be very sensitive. There is supply and demand, right? And that is really what drives the industry. Because if you think about the fact that if no one was purchasing those images, if no one was purchasing sex, then you wouldn't have a business. You'd be selling to no one, and no one would be making any money. And so similar to other industries, such as drugs, for example, you have the supply, the demand, and the product. And I hate to say it in that way, but that's oftentimes how it's described. The victims, and then this is where it really kind of gets interesting, is who is at risk. It is easy to say to yourself, my child probably would never, right? Would never even consider, talking to someone that didn't seem right, or I know everything my child is doing. Okay, I'm a mother of 4. So I can tell you that as much as you want to think we can always kind of elevate a little bit more in talking to our children, because any child who has ever used the internet, who's ever said to you, you don't understand, if you work with children, if you work for an agency, an organization, and or Youth Services Commission or anywhere, right, you know that this is what children do, particularly, right, age around 10, 11 and up. Right, they want to be accepted, right? They want to feel connected to other people. They want people to recognize them as being independent. Oftentimes, they take risks. Why? Because the brain is not yet developed yet, right? Our brains aren't developed until our mid-20s. So our kids tend to be impulsive regardless. Add into additional vulnerabilities if you happen to be working with a population or yourself have children who have either had a history of child sexual abuse, have been homeless, have been systemically marginalized or oppressed, right? This adds that layer of vulnerability, as well as involvement in the child welfare system. So I always say, to me, every child you come in contact with could be at risk, right? By sheer fact that they probably have one of these, right? A phone. And so with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about how the targeting happens so that you can kind of be more aware of how we could potentially prevent this. Now, the victims, 90% are typically under the control of a trafficker, meaning that a lot of times people say, well, she decided to do this on her own. That's pretty rare to go out and do things on your own. It has happened, it does happen, but most are under the control of a trafficker, the person who is kind of organizing, arranging the dates, arranging what's going to happen, and setting the quota for that person, that individual. And we also see a lot of survival trafficking, meaning exactly what it is, that young person is in survival and oftentimes does not have any other option. In the full day training of this, we do this activity called Words Matter. And why this matters to us is really how we kind of our lens and how we talk about the issue. So when I say teen prostitute to someone, which I don't, but if I were to say teen prostitute to someone, take a minute and think about what comes to mind when someone says teen prostitute. What does that person look like? How old is that teen in your mind? You can drop it in the chat. If I said teen prostitute, what do they look like? What do they act like? Be honest, right? When you have this image in your mind. Jodie Foster and Taxi Driver, around 16 of age, dressing provocatively, right? Yeah. So oftentimes when we do this activity, you have like something that comes to your right, an underage person selling themselves, right? A loner. They're maybe anywhere between 13 and 17. They're kind of making the choice to do this, right? Someone that's able to keep more of their money, right? It's how it sounds, right? And you start to have this image in your mind. And so you're all correct, right? That typically is how someone will see it. And years ago, if you saw a newspaper article and a teenager was involved, right, in the solicitation of sex, they would say teen prostitute. That is how they would reference it. And automatically, you kind of have this image. They're a little bit older. They're kind of a problem kid sometimes. They're promiscuous. They chose it, right? But if I say to somebody, that is a sexually exploited youth, that is a sexually exploited youth, what do you think typically people will respond like when I say, how old is this child? A child that's been sexually exploited. You can drop that in the chat. We should help them. A little younger, right? You start to think, well, maybe they're more like 8 to 12 or 9. That's right. Absolutely, Stacy. They're more like a victim. You start to have this, yes, Sky. People respond with more empathy, a preteen, a younger victim, right? So you start to kind of say like, well, they're like the victim here versus on the left, right? In actuality, right? They're the same. They're the same because a 14-year-old is a 14-year-old child, right? Brain's still not developed. And I don't know about any of you, but I don't know that you made the greatest decisions in life in your teen years, right? Most of us did not. We don't, right? Because we're still developing, yet the way that we talk about it is really, really important, right? And that in my perspective and our perspective here at Prevent Child Abuse New Jersey and the Child Wellness Institute is that they are deserving of comfort and support, even if you are 16 years old versus 9 years old, right? That you're still growing, still developing, and still valuable, right? And still a valuable person. Thank you for doing that activity. What we looked at in terms of the trafficker, like a lot of times people say, like, who are these people, right? And who's doing this? The average age of onset of pimping, as they're sometimes called, is 22 years of age. And a lot of the research looks at how they grew up, right? Now, I always preface this by saying, this is not an excuse. It is not an excuse for this behavior of taking a child, right, and using that child and exploiting them in that way. But it does offer perhaps an insight and a context. And the majority of traffickers experienced physical abuse, domestic violence, and they themselves had a family member involved in prostitution. A high number have also themselves experienced childhood sexual assault, which, if you know about child abuse, right, and you know about assault, really does impact you and how you see the world and how you see humans and see relationships to humans, right? And so many of them as well were trafficked themselves before becoming a trafficker. And you can see here, their average age when first trafficked is a little bit younger than the stats that we showed earlier. Men 16 years old, women 14 years old. Same activity. And what I usually do in the larger thing is the difference between the word pimp, right, and what comes to mind when you hear the word pimp. So you can throw that in the chat box. Same idea. What comes to mind? Snoop Dogg. Yeah. Nasty. Yeah, a person who exploits others. Controlling. Fur coat. Old. Gross. Yeah. Abusive. Controlling. Pimp. Now, I don't know how old everyone is in the group, but if you remember, this term has been used sometimes in a way that could be perceived as a flashy kind of, I don't want to say positive, but if you remember, there was a show called Pimp My Ride, right? And that there are a lot of songs that have this reference. In fact, places I've worked in the past, and actually places I currently work, when I'm working with youth, sometimes we'll say, well, pimp's like a good thing, right? It's like a guy who's like kind of a, he's cool, he's a ladies' man. They don't think of it in the way that it really actually might be. In fact, if you go to Party City, not that I promote them in any way, but there are costumes at Halloween, right, that have like the velour costume and so they kind of look at it in like a funny kind of way, when in fact, if I were to say they're a human trafficker, that this is somebody who exploits children, what would come to mind then for you or people you know? If I said that person's a trafficker. Oh, and Ebony, I see wealth associated with pimps. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely correct. Yeah. Organized. Very different perception. Dangerous business person. Right. And Gina, that you added the word dangerous, right? Like, it suddenly shifts, right, Kathleen, playing on their victims, calculated villain. It's really an interesting conversation. And this is a conversation, terrible human, doesn't value life, an abuser. That's right, Jim. And the interesting part, though, is that we do this activity with kids as well, right? And they start to see, like, I never thought of it like that they're the same person, right? It's a person that maybe has been glorified in some way, but we really should not be glorifying a person who takes a child, right, and sells them and uses them and exploits them in such a dangerous, controlling, violent way. And so I wanted to share this activity in the event that you take this back with you as you wherever you work, and have those conversations. Now, who is buying? Well, here is kind of the demand side of things, right? If in theory, we have 10 to 20,000 traffickers that are out there, and each one of them has in there, and sometimes they call them the stable or in their group, right? And the girls that they have under them, or others, they can have men as well and boys as well. They can never meet the demand. They can never meet the demand because the studies show that there are over 3 million buyers, right? And so even if each trafficker had 5 to 10 people working for them, they could never actually reach 3.5 million. It just would never happen, which is why there's always this kind of demand for young people to kind of come and work for them. And I'm saying work for them in that way to meet this constant stream of buyers that is out there. Now, who buys, right? People are often asking, like, what do they look like? How do we know? The majority, not 100%, but close, the majority in the portrait of a buyer are male, but not always. They range in race and ethnicity. They range in profession. They actually tend to have a higher level of education and employment. And typically, the majority of the time, not always, but the majority of the time, they are in a relationship. And why is really interesting as well, because those interviewed, almost half said that they felt uncomfortable asking their own partner for this sex act and therefore had purchased somebody else. 43% say that these individuals that they pay for should do anything asked of them because they are paying for it, and that they really just want to avoid an emotional commitment. So that's kind of the lens of a buyer. And again, I don't want to overgeneralize because it can go across different ages and different groups, but I did want to share that sometimes we have like in our mind the kind of person that could be buying, and that also varies as well. So what is contributing to domestic minor sex trafficking in New Jersey and throughout our country? So anyone who's in any of these fields has probably seen this nested system, right? And the nested system is really important because it's not just one factor. It's not just, oh, well, that child, girl or boy, right? They might have no support system, so that's the reason, right? Or they experience child abuse and neglect, that's the reason. That's part of the puzzle. But the other parts include our environment, right? The fact that there are higher rates of homelessness, the fact that there's poverty, right? The fact that in our environment, we have transit routes and we have airports and we have communities with limited resources. That's a fact in New Jersey, right? That we have this. And then even bigger than that is our society and what society is promoting and how do we talk about sex and the hypersexualization of youth. If I don't want to knock any social media platform in particular, but if any of you have ever gone on some of the social media platforms of which youth are dancing and or doing videos in a short clip, extremely hypersexualized. That is promoted more now than ever. We also have a lot of racism, right, that exists. We have gender-based violence, and we have the glorification of being a pimp. All of these things are kind of layered on top of each other. So it's not necessarily just one thing in itself. But I always use this when I'm looking at something, especially if I'm working with a survivor. I'll say, like, I have to understand the context of how this happened, and I can almost always find something in each of the layers. So the stages of exploitation. How does it happen? Typically, this happens over time. On occasion, it might happen a little faster than others, but there are 4 main recruitment tactics that if you work with young people and work with youth or anyone really that you think might benefit, this is important for you to kind of think about when you're talking about relationships with children, right? When we're talking to the children about healthy relationships, right? There are people who use the coercion tactic, which is exactly what it is. Sextortion, right? That are like, well, you know, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to send all of these pictures you sent me, right? Or I'm going to tell everyone you did X, Y, and Z, intimidation or threats. Then there's those that want to be your friend, right? And we all know that starting in like the middle school years and even sometimes a little bit younger, that peer influence is so important, right? Having friends, being accepted, having your needs being met, right? That this friend comes into your life to provide you the needs that you need to have met. The third is more of the context of we're in this together and we're in a relationship, and that's called seduction. And so they kind of use the feelings of that young person to manipulate the situation. And if you loved me, you would do this. And after all I've done for you as your partners, you know, your partner, this is kind of what you owe me, but I promise you a better life, right? Those are some of the seduction tactics. And then force, like many people think of that originally, but using physical force, violence, kidnapping, or drugs and drugging. So those are the 4 main tactics that we see. I'm going to share with you in a moment one of the tactics in a real example. But this is kind of some of the strategies that we look for and that we start to notice in sex trafficking of youth. They target vulnerable youth, which, as we talked about, most youth are vulnerable. They offer that thing, that love, that attention. They make false romantic involvement kind of proposals. For some, they offer food, housing, clothes, drugs, right? Something of value. They pretend they're helping. They use the social media. Again, they'll steal pictures off of people's sites and then try to use sextortion. Isolation, meaning that, kind of getting that youth away from their friend group, getting them away from their parents or their caregivers. And so these are just some. When I say using catchers or recruiters, sometimes traffickers themselves are not the ones going out and recruiting. They will employ others to do that for them, right? It could be others that look younger, right, and are able to kind of get that young person more connected, feel safe. We've seen situations of female recruiters because they kind of have that more maternal way about them. And so we see that sometimes can be one of the strategies that they use. Now, I'm going to have you take a look at this for a moment. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a real life example of somebody who slid into my daughter's DM, true story, when she was 14 years old. And here it is. And so I don't know if you can see this. Just take a moment. Now, this is Instagram. This slid into her DMs. She was 14, and the pictures that she had posted were in front of her school, right? So she and her friends were like, doing the thing, the selfies, and they were doing it, and if you have kids or have seen kids or have ever talked to any kids, you know that is very common. We, allowed her to get the Instagram at age 14, even though I know it's a younger 12 or 13 that they allow, but we were like, okay, at certain point, you can do that. And so based on some of the strategies that I just shared, share with me, if you don't mind, in the chat, what did you notice he's trying to do? Now you can see my daughter writes ew no, so just understand the level of conversation I have with her is probably more than is needed in life. But what did you notice he tries to do here? What kind of tactics is he using? Right, trying way too hard with the compliment. Yeah, the money, flattery. Right, Vincent? So the thing that gets her, that she shared, was not that she was going to, she's like, but like most kids, she's like, if they saw $1,000 and you're 14, you're like, oh my gosh, I can get the PS5, right? You're like, I can, like, that's amazing, right? It's a lot of money. And knowing that somebody her age might want validation, right? Including herself, right? Including herself. She wants somebody to tell her she's attractive, of course, right? That you start to want that kind of attention, right? And so just as easy, just as much as I monitor and all the things, this easily could have turned into a different direction, right? And she and I talked about other friends of hers might have looked at this and been like, well, they might have different opinions of what it means, what they would have to do. They might have no kind of real sense of what he would be asking to do, right? Or they do, but their perception based on their own history could have influenced the outcome a little differently. So I just wanted to share that I myself am not even immune. And my children are not either. And so things like this, I also wanted to say prior to this starting, right, they might be curious. Oh, good question. She showed it to me first. I actually happened to be teaching across the street from her high school at a different school. And she sent it to me as I was walking in and was like, look, and I was like, oh my gosh. So now I'm sending messages to the world about how do we get this person? Well, by that point, that person, he, has the phone numbers, probably a burner phone and it's many accounts, etc. But yeah, no, she showed it to me. Yeah, because I try to catch it all, but they can delete things. If they are on Snap, things disappear. So it's really wild. But I just wanted to share this as like even I struggle, right? And making sure that prevention piece is always first and foremost in my conversations with kids about the reality of what this is. And she still probably doesn't understand the full reality. But it can happen. But yeah, he used all of the things. And I also want to share that sometimes in the morning, my child might be happy. Okay. And then by afternoon, they're not happy and they're angry with me for some reason. And I don't know what I did. Right. Because adolescents, right, their brains are pruning and their brains are going through a lot of impulse things throughout the day. So one moment of feeling down on yourself or feeling like my parent does not, think I'm mature enough and you don't think I'm, those things happen in an instant, an absolute instant. So I just wanted to share that with you. So in the phases, so let's say that they have recruited somebody in the sense that somebody responds to that message, right? And they end up meeting up, right, with either the person who's the recruiter, the captor, or the trafficker themselves. The beginning phase is the indoctrination phase. It's where they're breaking in or really getting that person scared, right? So that they feel that intense violence, uncertainty, right? And so much so that they're like, I can't get out of this. Now, remember, if you are 14, if you're 12, if you're 17, right? And somebody is extremely intensely violent with you and then suddenly makes you exhausted and you're not exactly sure how to handle this, that in itself makes you very vulnerable and less likely to leave, because your brain is saying, like, I don't know what the right thing to do is, but I'm scared to leave because I might die, or someone in my family might die. So that phase is very intense and happens right after they kind of are recruited and brought in. The branding part is usually like a tattoo of a name or something that says kind of, you belong to me, of that person. Other things that happen at this stage is the fact that control has to be established in order to, I don't want to say make sure someone doesn't leave, but in essence, make sure someone doesn't leave. So that involves a lot of emotional abuse, gaslighting, like, you're crazy, this is normal, I don't know why you're upset with me after all I've done with you, beatings, torture, taking their documents so they can't leave. It's very, very kind of reflective and reminiscent of the power and control wheel that you might have seen with intimate partner violence and domestic violence, right? Is that power and control doesn't always just look physical. That emotional abuse, the humiliation, playing mind games, making the victim themselves, who in this case is a child, right, feel like they're at fault for choosing this, they're to blame for this. Isolation, minimizing the situation. And then on the other hand, offering them some kind of privilege, right? To say, well, in turn, I give you McDonald's, I buy you a pretty bracelet, I take you places. And so that is kind of how they establish control. The victims themselves are usually exploited year round, every day, and sometimes can see 10 or more. The case that they shared at the summit that was held, illustrated this point of a young person who was exploited in all day, right, with multiple buyers, and forced to meet certain amount of money and certain quotas. So in the last 5 to 7 minutes of the presentation, because I do want to allow for any questions, some of the things people will ask is, or say, prevention is important, and they can use some of the pieces we just shared to have those conversations with youth. Some of the things you might see if you're currently working with youth, just to pay attention to, is there's both the physical harm, which you can see listed here, bodily injuries, traumatic brain injury, STIs, pregnancy, but there's also that psychological piece, the piece that in order for your brain to survive has to sort of disassociate from what's happening. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of PTSD, and oftentimes if they are in a relationship with the trafficker, or they, even in that friendship kind of way, might have traumatic bonding with their trafficker as well. And so when we're looking, and if you work with youth, some of the things you might be looking for or seeing, if they are branded with someone else's name, or a nickname that they've been given. Sometimes that young person's name will not be called that name to this trafficker. They'll go under an alias. They have a significant other who seems to be very much older and controlling, that they start to say inconsistent stories, or their stories sound very scripted when asked about it. If they suddenly have expensive items, multiple cell phones. I will share with you a friend of mine who works in a school district, and we did this training. She went through it, and afterwards did have a young person that had several cell phones. And she said, like, at the time of going through the training, you're looking at the list and you're like, okay, but you're not, unless you are experiencing it, you don't remember it right away. But that moment where this young person had several cell phones, she remembered this slide of like, why would this person need 3 cell phones? And it does turn out that that teenager was being trafficked. So just keep this in mind. And again, this is available to you afterwards, so that if by some chance, you are thinking about it, or it's sitting with you, that you have this to reference. And why it's so hard to identify this, as you can imagine, is that our children are coached, right? And the traffickers typically will watch or escort them. Even if they go to the hospital or they go to the doctor, that person is constantly the watchful eye to make sure they're not saying anything. A lot of times our girls and boys don't think they are victims themselves and blame themselves for the situation they feel they've gotten themselves into. And sometimes they have mixed feelings, mixed emotions and positive feelings towards that trafficker. The immediate needs, should you encounter, what I would say would be to get the support you need from the resources I'll share with you in a moment, but that this young person will need a lot of support, not just, oh, we removed them from the situation, so they're fine now. That's not quite how it works. There's a lot involved, including legal services in terms of what they might have been charged with doing, mental health services. They might need substance abuse treatment. And so I always look at it as like, what are the immediate needs? And then what are some of the layered needs and things that ongoing can help support this person as they begin to survive this. And so I'll end with the fact that we feel prevention, every single person, all 90 of you on this call, can be prevention. Just by coming here today and expressing interest, you care clearly about trafficking of our youth. You care about how do we ensure that our children are safe. And so I look at things as we can universally all be speaking this language of making sure that we talk about it, we keep our eyes open, but we educate our youth as well about healthy relationships, about trafficking. And then if you work with a more vulnerable population, perhaps doing more intense conversations about this, so that they're aware of what's going on, similar to even the social media example I gave you as well. So we have a number of strategies that unfortunately we no longer get state funding for, but we are interested in partnering with people on grants through our Child Wellness Institute or private funding, any foundation that might be interested in this work. And it kind of goes in these categories: engaging boys and men in the conversations, reducing the demand for child exploitation, understanding consent and relationships, media literacy, which clearly can be helpful for our kids, and promoting equity and inclusion as well. And don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but one of the other highest risk populations are those who are in marginalized or oppressed communities, and including our LGBTQI kids as well. So I always try to point that out because it's really important to keep that in mind. I think awareness is important. Sometimes we get caught up in like, how do we rescue? And after it's happened. And what I really just wanted to stress for today is thank you for listening about prevention as well, and why it's so important to start to shift our values and our norms about what is healthy for our kids. And these changes in our climate, for example, the hypersexualization of our youth, is really helpful in reducing the child sexual exploitation of our children. And so there are other strategies. There's plenty of groups I know the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking is fantastic. There are like SINAR, there are plenty of groups that are fantastic that offer a lot of support. I'm going to fly through this for a second, just so that you have a resource, because it's 10:45. And that is, if you have any other questions, and or the youth that you're working with has a question, they should have this number. And so that way, maybe they don't trust anyone right now, but they can text help or info to Be Free and get some support, or at least be able to ask a question. In New Jersey specifically, I wanted to just lift up some fabulous resources. My team does a lot of the prevention education. These groups here are really supportive of survivors, and I cannot say enough good things about them. So here are some numbers for you as well. If you feel that you have a youth that is being trafficked by someone that's not a caregiver to them, somebody like a relationship, girlfriend or boyfriend, you would call the trafficking hotline. If you suspect something that is child abuse related, meaning it's a caregiver of that youth, you would call 877 NJ abuse. The last group on here, You Are More Than, is fantastic, survivor led, and also focuses on the LGBTQI community. In the prevention element, if you have the desire to partner on types of prevention, we offer some furthering things here. On the right is a 3-part series for your staff, for yourself, to kind of dig a little deeper than the 40 minutes I was able to get into. And it's 3 parts. It talks about domestic minor sex trafficking. Then it also talks about prevention. And then we do a part on survivor to thriver. And so really working with survivors in kind of a somewhat holistic and therapeutic way. And so you would get a certificate at the end of that, and you can see that's on the right. And on the left, for youth, we get this question a lot. We have a presentation that we do virtually. We can also do it in person, and it's called Exposing Exploitation. And it's perfect for, I'd say, ages 14 to 21. Those are just kind of 2 examples of prevention that we do. And if there's any interest, I just wanted to share it with you. But again, we'd have to find the dollars somehow. And I just wanted to say thank you. If you want to reach out to me, or have any further questions, didn't want to put it maybe in the box, but wanted to just ask a question, I'd be more than happy to talk with you. And any of the partners we listed as well are excellent, and they are advocates, and all of us are really working together to try to keep our kids protected and safe. And so with that, I'll shut my face.
No, you don't have to do that. I thought this was fantastic and really helpful. And thank you, Gina, for taking the time to do this. We will, and there's a couple of questions that we do have, but we will again make this video available on our website, and we will share the PowerPoint presentation with everyone who was on this, who registered for the event today. So we'll make it available, and we apologize if you had someone who couldn't get on after we had gotten started, but we'll make sure to make this available, because there was a lot of information that I think Gina shared. And I know this is a much longer presentation, and you condensed it into 45 to 50 minutes. And again, I thought it was really helpful. And I think we'll have to have you back, at the end of the year for some additional follow-up training. But a couple of questions that we did have, let's see, I think you answered the one about additional, if you wanted to educate yourself. I think this PowerPoint presentation includes a number of different resources that you can access online through your group, through the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. They have a terrific website, and educating myself on the issue for our summit, I relied mostly on your website and the website for the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. So let's see, questions and answers. Anything with the schools? Do you work with the schools? Is there something that the schools are being proactive about, Gina?
Yeah. So I think I saw someone ask about recruitment happening in schools, and unfortunately that has happened. Meaning that sometimes traffickers, or they will again have someone else that is in the school already, who might be a senior or might be there recruiting. That has happened. Yes, it has. They've gotten other kids to do it as well. We've seen a whole bunch of different cases. So that is really why we say if schools can get on board with educating, and there is a statute that says that schools should have education about this, both for the staff and for the children as well. And our 3-part series does cover what the state of New Jersey DOE does expect in terms of what's in the content. So what we've done for schools, we've done the assembly exposing exploitation. We've done it either virtually or we've done it in person, live in like large assembly format. But then we find that sometimes there's like a certain level of students you might have more concern about. So we've offered what's called My Life, My Choice, which is another prevention model that does several weeks of groups with youth talking, really digging in to their perception of relationships, things that they've observed, how they feel about certain things that they've experienced in their lives. And so that's what we've done in the schools. And we've also had a group for young men, boys, those identifies boys as it's called Empowering Young Men, and really seeing them as allies in this prevention experience. And then of course, we've done a lot of professional development for teachers. I've gone to a lot of schools for staff. And I also just wanted to share for parents. We've had a couple districts call us in for parenting workshops just like this. And they're like, what? So it's, if you can get parents really, part of it, I mean, that helps, for all of us to kind of be on the same page.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Great question.
As a parent. Here's another great, we have, I think, 3 more questions and then we can wrap it up. And this was, I thought, a great question. Is the Apple AirTag really being used? This is from Jessica King, used to tag cars for future kidnapping and air trafficking, like has been posted in the social media news? And I've seen those videos where I guess they use the zip tie and they put it on a car handle. I think that's what Jessica is referring to. Is that a legitimate tactic?
I cannot say if it's legitimate or not. I think, Jessica, I've heard the same thing that you have. I have not experienced personally anyone that has happened to, but I have heard about it as well. So I can't I can't say for sure. So sorry, I won't be able to speak to that, but I have heard the same thing. And again, then, creates this whole thing in my mind about how do you how do you prevent that, and how do you really prevent that awareness and safety?
Yeah, and I think a follow-up question from Jessica was, and what internet prevention strategies do you suggest to parents to reduce the risk? Shut the power off in your house, I would say, when they come from school. But if you have anything else, Gina, I think that.
Yeah. So I have always recommended Bark. I don't work for them. They do not pay me anything, but the Bark app is installed. And so when some types of content come up for, and is in conversation, but certain platforms do not allow themselves to be monitored. So Snapchat is one of them. So Snapchat though does have a filter system that you can put parental controls in, but you have to go into your child's phone and go into the Snapchat and then set those filters. And then Verizon and other phone companies allow you also to monitor some of the social media content, and you can block websites from the Verizon My Family app, for example. Others do it as well. And so you can go into the Verizon My Family app and say, you know what, no Instagram for you, and WhatsApp, no for you, because WhatsApp is another one that's very popular in communicating with you. So it really is incumbent upon us, because I can't see any middle schooler child in my family that would say, I'm voluntarily going to block myself from these apps. They don't, they're kids. They want to do what everyone else they think is everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
Those are my suggestions.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. A couple more, if you don't mind. So we have, and this is from Alice. What is the difference between child pornography and child sexual abuse material?
Right. So at the beginning of the presentation, I think you're referring to that. So it's just the semantics, it's the language that we use. Just like we don't say teen prostitute because it has this kind of, that person did it because they wanted to. We found that child pornography sounds like they're involved in the pornography business intentionally, like they, and so we just stay away from that term and we call it really what it is. And so that's just the change in language, but it's talking about the same content. Good question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And what age would you suggest starting these conversations with your children?
It's a really good question. I would say really as young as they understand, I don't even know how to say this, but understand like observations of other things that are not feeling so good or feeling scary to them. I think I personally started when my kids were maybe like 8 or 9. Now, I don't go in there and say like, let's talk about sex trafficking, or you just talk about safety, about online safety, about well, what do you think about that? You know, kind of those open dialogue pieces. I didn't start talking about the fact that somebody might try to talk to you online until my kids started playing video games. So whatever age that is in your home, could be 5, could be 8, because a couple of video games, other people can talk to your child on, they can start to have a conversation. You know, the kids have their headsets on, so I don't always know, you know, what they're doing or who they're talking to. Sometimes I hear them talking to their friends, and other times I'll see the messages coming in on the platform. So I would say if you have kids that have access to that, start the conversation with, if you don't know that person, like, they go, who is that person? Oh, they're just this guy from whatever. And, you know, I start a conversation with, how do you know that, right? And so we only friend the people who are our friends in our school or our friends, you know, that are next door to us. So I would start the conversation young, but you don't have to go in with like, right, the sex trafficking conversation until I'd say maybe like the middle school age. Another great question.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. If I missed any of your questions, Gina's email is on the screen right there. And I know she'd be happy to answer any questions that you get. You can also email me and I'll forward your questions to Gina if you have any after the presentation. And we'll end with this last question, because I think this is a really good one as well, because you see a lot of this on social media. Is the 911 hand signal legit?
I don't know. How do I answer that?
Yeah.
I don't know, because like anything else, things can go in either direction, right? Like with anything else. And I get worried about some of that with, sometimes kids think they're, like I said about the children's brains, right? They're impulsive, right? And so you have some who that might be legit for them and what they're experiencing. And they're saying, this is right, I'm giving this signal. And then you have others that are messing around thinking it's funny or making a joke of it. And so I don't know where that line is.
Right.
That is another really good question. And I wish I had an answer for you.
Yeah, no, I think you answered it perfectly. So
yeah.
So thank you. And Gina, thank you again for taking the time to do this today. I thought it was really helpful. You're an incredible resource on this, and we'll definitely have you back this year to do another presentation.
Thank you.
We appreciate it a great deal. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you all, and feel free to reach out.
Angela. You did a great job with all the IT stuff, as always. Take care. Have a good day.